Typically when you create a footprint roof, you're going to use slope-defining edges to determine the slope of the roof. What do you do if the direction of the slope does not run parallel to one of the edges of your roof? Well, in that case, you can use slope arrows to indicate the slope of your roof. In this movie, we'll take a look at slope arrows. The file I have on screen is called Slope Arrows, and I'm looking at a few simple examples. And what we'll do is we'll start with the one over here on the left, and we'll make a really simple slope arrow modification. So again, the purpose of using a slope arrow is simply when the slope does not run parallel to any one of the edges. So if I were to edit the footprint of this roof, if I change any one of these edges to slope defining, it makes that edge a hinge. It runs the slope along that direction, but what if the slope actually runs diagonally across the building from corner to corner? Then I can't really use a sloped edge to indicate that. I need to do another technique, and that's where a slope arrow might be handy. So over here on the ribbon, boundary line was what we looked at when we actually created roofs. In this case, we're going to choose slope arrow, and then it defaults to drawing it by a line, which is what I'll do. And I'm going to simply snap an endpoint to this corner and drag all the way across the diagonal of the square to the opposite corner. And that's a slope arrow. Now, what can you do with a slope arrow? Once you have it, I'm going to select it, and you direct your attention over to the Properties palette. What happens is Revit can determine the slope along that arrow in one of two ways. The default behavior is to specify the height of the arrow at its tail and then an offset from that height at its head. So in other words, the default right here says the height at the tail, meaning this end of the arrow here. And it's a little tough to see, but if I pre-highlight it, it's a little easier to see. Notice that the arrowhead is on the right side, and on the left side, we're seeing the tail of the arrow. So down at the tail, it's set at 0, and then the default behavior is to rise up 10 feet above that by the time it gets to the arrowhead. Now that would make a really steep slope, and actually I'm going to go ahead and leave that because it'll be a very dramatic effect and we'll be able to see very clearly what's happened. Now the other alternative we have is we can actually define it by slope instead. If you did that, it would turn all this off and you could just put in your typical rise over run slope instead. I'm going to go back to height at tail and I'll leave all the defaults. Go ahead and apply that, and then I'm going to click finish. And what you'll see is the slope arrow ran along this way, and it actually is determining the plane of the slope. And if it's not real clear to you, I'm going to go ahead and orbit this a little, holding down the shift key and dragging with the wheel, and you can kind of see that it's sloping in all three directions. Like that view maybe shows it best. So the top edge of each wall follows a different slope. And sometimes you see churches with a roof like this or something along those lines, right? Now let's do a similar example. What happens if you add more than one slope arrow? So I'm going to just tilt my view back down a little so I can have a better look. And I'll select this guy right here, edit the footprint, and I'm going to add a slope arrow. Actually, this time, what I'm going to do first is I'll do a boundary line, which I'm going to erase, but I just want to draw the diagonal just to kind of give me something to work with. And then I'll add a slope arrow from here to the midpoint. Now, I don't want to leave this boundary line because Revit will complain because it won't understand what to do with the sketch. So I'm going to just select that and delete it. But you see how that gave me the ability to draw the slope arrow nice and clean along the diagonal? I'm going to select it, and I'm going to use the same settings, but I'll drop it down a little bit this time. Let's go down to 5 feet and apply that. And then this time I'm going to mirror that slope arrow, and I'm using the mirror along an axis. So I'm going to draw the axis from here to here, and that will actually draw a mirrored copy of that slope arrow facing the other one. Let me zoom in a little bit here. So you can see that we have one slope arrow pointing this way, another one pointing this way. They start at 0 down here and here, and they both end up at 5 feet in the middle. So what that's actually going to do is something similar to the guy over here, except that we're going to end up with a ridge along this diagonal here. So let's go ahead and click finish. And you can see that that gives us a ridge line because that really defined two diagonal planes now. And it looks something like that. Now you can actually get even more complex still. And I've already kind of done all the work on this one, and I'm just going to show you what I did here. But here's a roof with a couple crickets, and those crickets are defined with slope arrows as well. I'm just going to select on it, go to Edit Footprint, and I'll just show you where the slope arrows are. To make this one work, I had to actually break this sketch line into several pieces. You can see that as I highlight my mouse over there. So there's actually several sketch lines underneath there. I use the split tool for that. You just split it at a point in each of those locations. And then I drew my slope arrows, and if I click on one of those, it goes from 0 just up 6 inches. So it's just a small amount. And then I mirrored it over here, and then I copied those over there. So it took a little bit of effort, but otherwise it was exactly the same procedure that we just used over here. And when you finish it, it ends up just tilting those sloping edges up just a touch. Now, the one thing I want to point out is if you tab in right here, right there, that's actually the roof edge. And with it highlighted there, let me actually copy it to show you. Okay, it doesn't have the little triangle. That one is not slope defining. Don't put a slope arrow right on top of a slope defining edge. Revit won't like that. Okay, it'll complain and bad things will happen. So anyway, there you have it. Those are slope arrows. So that gives you the control to create unusually sloped conditions when the slope doesn't run parallel to a roof edge.